A woman's freedom can reshape her entire life. As Julia escapes the pressures of her billionaire father, she seeks refuge in a stranger. But this escape will lead her not only to freedom but also to an unexpected love. In her journey to find her true identity, Julia will face the truths ahead of her while fleeing from the shadows behind. But can escaping be enough to save a love? If you're ready for a heart-pounding, courageous story, join us on this journey. Don't miss Julia and Paul's fight for freedom, love, and survival. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more excitement and unforgettable moments, because this story is just getting started. The sun, with its golden autumn light, was turning the branches of the trees into flames as Paul drove without stopping for even a moment behind the wheel of his old pickup. The car, slowly moving forward, was like a loyal friend that had served him for years, a companion who knew the roads by heart and took every turn safely. But inside Paul, something felt different at that moment. It was as if something was wrong, but what was it? Was it fatigue? The weight of life? Every day, as he tried to build a better life for Anna as a single father, the emptiness inside him was growing larger. There was something lost in his eyes. Anna, 6 years old, the only person who looked at him with love every morning, but Paul was trying to be enough for her, weighed down by dark thoughts and the burden of the past. Loneliness sometimes felt too heavy. With every step, another weight was added to his heart. After a while, on the side of the road leading to the town, Paul squinted. At first he didn't notice, but then he saw the silhouette. In that moment, time slowed down. There was only one woman on the road, but her presence was more intense, more real than anything else. Her long black hair, pale skin, and the fear in her eyes seemed to have vanished with the last rays of the sun. But that look. Paul felt something was wrong. Those eyes were symbols of helplessness and despair. He wanted to speed up, but something stopped him. The woman looked so lonely that Paul suddenly felt an emptiness in his heart. He slowly pulled the car to the side. He felt indecision, but those eyes. They had broken down all of Paul's defenses. As he walked toward her, his body was tense, there was a sense of danger, but at the same time he felt that something would be resolved. It was as if she was a part of his fate, and the woman took a step toward him. The woman, wearing a thin coat, seemed almost lost under the gloomy autumn light. With each step, there was a sadness that reminded Paul of something. The coat barely wrapped around her fragile body, but her eyes. In her eyes, there were traces of a lost soul searching for a way out. Those looks pierced Paul's heart, reminding him of something deep. He saw someone who felt lost, someone trapped within themselves. He cracked the window and the cold air filtered in, but Paul didn't feel disturbed by the chill for a moment. It was as if the woman's gaze had taken all the warmth from his body. Gently, yet with uncertainty, he asked, "Are you going somewhere?" His voice echoed even in the midst of the wind's howl, but there was unease within Paul. Asking that question felt like opening a door. At that moment, the woman took a step closer, and something else appeared in her eyes, perhaps a glimmer of hope or maybe deep loneliness. Paul, without knowing the woman's story, wasn't sure whether it was right to help her. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker that seemed like a piece of himself lost inside. The woman briefly shifted the emptiness in her eyes somewhere else, but then, lifting her head slightly, her voice sounded like a fragile whisper, "Yes. But I don't know. I just have to go somewhere." At that moment, Paul felt the woman's lostness and indecision more clearly. Those looks were from someone searching for a solution but not knowing where to go. She was a stranger, yet Paul felt as if she was someone he had known before. A silence deepened between them as the air grew colder. Outside, the autumn wind made the deep emptiness under her thin coat even more noticeable. Paul looked at the woman and realized he had to make a decision. Just one step could change the course of everything. "If you want something warm to drink, get in my car," he said, feeling the determination in his voice without realizing it. He slowly rolled the window down, breathing in the air, feeling that something was about to change. This woman, perhaps representing someone lost, or someone trying to find a missing piece of herself. The woman paused for a second, uncertainty in her eyes, but then, gently opening the door, she got in. With trembling hands she thanked him. "Thank you," her voice carrying a delicate yet deep sense of emotion. Paul felt her shivering as if every step she took carried the weight of some past. At that moment, the woman wasn't just a traveler. She seemed like a part of Paul's own lost piece, as if an unconscious coincidence had brought them together. Paul, keeping his eyes on the road, leaned slightly toward the woman. "What's your name?" he asked with a curiosity and need in the silence. Learning her identity, perhaps, was his way of unraveling the mystery just a bit more. "Julia," the woman replied, pausing for a moment. Julia King. When Paul heard the name, he tried to understand her identity. Julia King. Was it a name he recognized? No, but her eyes. They weren't joyful. On the contrary, there was a deep sadness. Something in her eyes made Paul uneasy. It was as if she was running from something. Those eyes held a mysterious past, and solving that mystery had become essential for Paul. For a while, silence ruled. Only the sound of the car's tires rolling on the asphalt could be heard. Without taking his eyes off the road, Paul asked another question. It's not easy to leave here. Where would you like to go? Julia lowered her head for a moment, as if searching for a very deep question within herself. Then, the tremor in her voice wrapped around Paul's heart. I don't know, but somewhere. I'm running away from my father, she said softly. Paul was momentarily stunned by the words. It was as if there was a moment that slowed time. He quickly turned his eyes toward her. From your father? He asked, his lips trembling. He felt the pain on her face as if she carried a whole life with it. In that moment, Paul wasn't just a traveler. He had become the beginning of Julia's dark story. Julia took a deep breath, her eyes seemed to drift away for a moment. Paul could feel the pain hidden beneath each word. Yes, she finally said, her voice trembling but resolute. My father controls me. He decides everything for me. Who I'll marry, what job I'll have, what I'll wear. And I can't stand it anymore. I'm running away because I have no other choice. I want to be free. In that moment, Paul saw something in the woman's eyes, a mix of helplessness and determination. There was such deep sadness, as if years of accumulated pain had suddenly surfaced. But there was also a resolve. Julia was risking everything for her freedom. In that moment, Paul began to truly feel the strength of this woman. In every step, there was a search for freedom, in every word, a courage. Paul briefly thought about his own life. He often found himself struggling with the dream of leaving everything behind and carving his own path. However, life was sometimes shaped by other people's rules and expectations. In his own story, many decisions had been made by others. But Julia had resisted that. The fragile yet strong side of that woman, known to everyone, was emerging. The struggle within her mirrored the silent battle within Paul. He was trying to understand what he could sacrifice to gain his own freedom. In that moment, he realized how valuable this woman's struggle and determination were. Julia was running from the kind of life Paul knew all too well, the pain of leaving control of his life to others. It was so similar that, for a brief moment, the two strangers witnessed each other's stories. As they drove down the road, Julia's voice deepened the pain and determination in her words. My father has tried every way to control my life, she said, with a fleeting emptiness in her eyes, each word carrying the accumulated pain of years. But I don't want to live the life he wants anymore. Even as I ran, he sent people after me. But I can't run any longer. As Paul continued driving, listening to her words, he became drawn into his own thoughts. Julia's story was one of someone who was always running, yet never finding a safe place to trust. She was so alone and fragile, wanting to be a step away from everything. Paul placed himself in her shoes. His own escapes in life were perhaps just another reflection of Julia's suffering. Always running from something, yet not having a single path to trust. It was so similar that he felt a connection between them. But there was a difference. Julia's story was one where the danger was much closer, and her escape was becoming increasingly impossible. As they continued on the road, the calm from just moments ago seemed to have vanished. Paul felt how quickly everything could change. They were in danger, though realizing it was only a matter of time. Suddenly, the headlights of a vehicle behind them became clearer. Paul quickly glanced in the rearview mirror, his heart racing as he noticed an SUV closing in behind them. The headlights, merging with the darkness behind them, gave him the sense that a threat was approaching. When Julia noticed, she immediately looked into Paul's eyes. Her eyes were filled with fear and concern. A shiver ran through her body. Quietly but with a deep tremor, she said, "They." Her voice barely audible, but Paul's alarm bells began to ring. As the car quickly approached, Julia's fear became not just a background hum, but a real and growing threat. "They found me." Julia's voice trembled and fear echoed through every word, making Paul's heart race faster. "Don't leave me," she said, gripping her chest with both hands. "Please help me." Paul quickly saw the approaching SUV in the rearview mirror. Time was slipping by fast, but every second in that moment was more critical than the last. Thinking quickly, he turned to Julia. "Okay, Julia, you need to duck down and move to the back seat now," he said, his voice filled with determination. But they couldn't waste a second. Then Paul focused on the road again, but his eyes drifted to the little girl waking up in the back seat. "Hey Anna," he murmured, his voice softening. "Julia is looking at the little girl under the blanket in the back of the car." The little girl was just waking up. Anna, slowly opening her eyes, straightened up and lifted her head. "Daddy? Who's that?" she asked, still half asleep, but her voice was filled with curiosity. Paul tried to calm her, his eyes still scanning the road ahead. "We need to hide this sweet lady," he whispered. Julia nodded and slowly moved to the back seat. Paul looked at her, seeing the mix of fear and resolve in her eyes, and said, "Hide under the blanket next to Anna." Anna immediately pulled the blanket around herself, covering Julia completely. Meanwhile, Paul carefully slowed down, keeping the SUV in sight, but knowing he had to move quickly. Anna, thinking of their safety, lowered her head and said as calmly as she could, "We don't tell anyone the truth, okay, Daddy?" She took a step forward, her every movement radiating trust. "Okay, Daddy." Julia curled up in the back seat and hid under the blanket. Anna followed suit and they both stayed completely hidden. Quickly, everyone fell into silence. But a few minutes later, the SUV pulled ahead of Paul's car. In that moment, the air shifted. The tension and danger felt palpable, as if the next move would determine everything. The SUV suddenly swerved in front of Paul's car. Paul instinctively slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a stop. The headlights quickly slid over their car, shining brightly on them. Two men hurriedly got out of the vehicle and walked straight toward Paul's car. Paul smiled calmly, but the tension inside him was palpable. He rolled down the window and in a calm voice said, "What's going on, gentlemen?" One man showed Paul a photo in his hand. "Have you seen this woman?" he asked. Paul carefully examined the photo and recognized Julia's picture, but without revealing it on his face he said, "No. Sorry, is she missing?" The man paused for a moment, nodding silently in response. The other man was carefully inspecting the car. After a few seconds of silence, the man asked, "Can we search your car?" Paul thought quickly and replied, "Oh, I'd like to say yes, but my daughter is asleep," his eyes shifting to the back seat, where he subtly signaled to Julia. The men, undeterred by Paul's answer, continued as one of them took another step forward and said, "With all due respect, we'll have to wake her." At that moment, Anna's sleepy voice came from the back seat. "Dad, are we there yet?" Anna poked her head out from under the blanket, slowly opening her eyes. The men immediately froze, staring at her. Paul felt his heart race, but he didn't step back. "Let us go, gentlemen," he said, his voice firm and calm. One of the men replied, "The kid's already awake," a little more unsettled. But just then, Anna's crying suddenly shifted the atmosphere. "Dad, I'm scared. Dad, I'm hungry." The little girl began crying loudly, and everything seemed on the verge of spiraling out of control. Paul tensed and shifted his gaze to the men. However, Anna's crying was part of the strategy. She was deliberately crying, playing this game to get the men to back off. After a moment, one of the men said, "All right," with patience. "We'll clear the way," he added, walking back toward the SUV. The men realized they couldn't hold on any longer. Paul quickly pressed the gas pedal, moving the car forward. Anna was still crying, but she knew she'd have to stop soon. She had tricked the men and the way was cleared. "You're amazing, Anna," Paul whispered, giving her the reassurance that would help her calm down. They slowly accelerated and continued down the road. The determination to stay ahead of the men had somewhat diminished, but this was only one victory. There were still many dangers ahead. But with trust in each other, Anna and Paul knew they would face the night together. When Paul noticed the cabins by the creek, a sense of relief washed over him. Perfect, he thought, this place could be a temporary refuge. He quickly steered the car and parked next to one of the cabins. He needed to take advantage of this opportunity to keep Anna and Julia safe. "Anna, Julia, stay in the car," he said calmly, giving them a careful wink. At that moment, Paul noticed a man outside the cabin, quickly realizing they had arrived and rushing toward them. The man approached with a smile, asking, "Hello, are you looking for a place to stay? Our cabins are great, with a view of the creek and the mountains." Paul smiled in response to the man's friendly demeanor. "Sounds great," he said sincerely, liking the offer. "I'll take it for the night, but I might extend it." The man stepped a little closer and, looking Paul in the eyes, asked, "Are you alone, sir?" Paul hesitated for a moment. The question made it hard to answer without thinking. He paused quickly and then something logical popped into his mind. No, my daughter and..." He started, then paused, thinking carefully. "My daughter and my wife are in the car," he said, hoping the answer would be the right one. But suddenly, what crossed Paul's mind was that Julia appearing as a stranger here could be dangerous. There were people nearby searching for her with her picture. Because of that, Julia couldn't easily pass as anyone else. That's why he had to be extra cautious. If this small town noticed their presence, everything could spiral out of control. The man told Paul to park the car in front of the cabin and said, "I'll be right back with the paperwork, sir." After Paul parked the car, the man quickly approached them and asked seriously, "Can I see your ID?" Paul, a bit taken aback, quickly started thinking and pulled out his wallet. "Let me give you my ID," he said. "Oh darn it. My wife's ID must have been left at the hospital," he added, with some hesitation. "She had a headache on the way here and we stopped by the emergency. I hope that's not a problem, she must have left it there. I'll call the hospital right away and have them send it over. I'll give you our address here and once the ID comes we'll show it to you." The man nodded, smiling. "No problem at all, sir, your ID is enough." Paul took a deep breath and felt a little relief, but the tension inside him didn't go away. "I've really turned into a liar," he murmured, but this time he wasn't laughing, he was more annoyed. He turned back to the car and called out to Julia. "Julia, I want you to pull your hood up and hide yourself," he said, then turned to Anna and added, "Anna, you distract them, we'll walk to the cabin without making eye contact." Julia quickly lowered her head and pulled her hood up, trying to conceal herself completely. Anna, on the other hand, carefully scanned the surroundings and, with her childlike energy, skipped and sang her way to the cabin. After watching both of them move, Paul slowly started walking toward the cabin. He took careful steps, his eyes scanning the surroundings and watching every movement closely. After they entered the cabin, everyone took a deep breath and felt a bit of relief. Julia removed her hood and turned to Paul. There was gratitude in her eyes and her voice trembled as she said, "Thank you so much for hiding me," her eyes welling up. "Anna, you're such a smart girl. I don't know what I would have done without you. It's like I'm a child again, my father is looking for me. Oh my God." Paul spoke calmly, his face softening with reassurance. "Hey, we can stay hidden here for a few days and you can figure out what to do next," he said, trying to give Julia some encouragement. Anna suddenly brightened at the mood in the room. "Dad, are we staying in the cabin?" "Yay," she exclaimed, laughing and openly showing her joy. "We're on vacation." Paul laughed. "Yes, but no one should know about Julia. If anyone asks, you should say she's your mother," he said, smiling at Anna's excitement. Anna nodded slightly. "Okay," she replied. Paul then turned to Julia and said gently, "Please rest. Collect your thoughts and we'll talk later," his tone becoming a bit more serious. Julia took a deep breath. "Thank you so much," she said, her eyes still full of gratitude. "I owe you." Paul shook his head. "I had to do this," he said, showing a sense of calm and reassurance. Now, their safety and comfort were more important than anything else. As the days passed, Julia's determination to break free from her father's control became more and more tangible. Paul continued to help her in every way, but Julia was now ready to do anything to gain her freedom. They were no longer alone. With trust in each other, they were growing stronger with each step. Paul was by Julia's side, always encouraging her, but the worry inside him never seemed to disappear. Together, they had made a plan to outsmart her father's men and erase his past influence over her. However, there was still a sense of unease within Paul. While Julia's courage and desire for freedom inspired him, he also wanted to avoid putting her in harm's way. Her safety came first and one wrong step could risk everything. Paul was a brave man, but he didn't want the dark past that Julia had endured to harm her any further. Every plan came with a price and he wanted to move forward with Julia toward a new life, putting her above everything else. But at the same time he considered the possibility of everything turning against them at any moment, making sure to take careful steps. They had set out on this journey, a path that would shape not only their destinies but also Julia's freedom and rebirth. But they had to remain vigilant, for the past was still chasing them, never letting go. As the days passed, Julia's resolve to break free from her father's control became increasingly tangible. With courage, she took to the media to announce her story. It was time to declare her freedom, not to run anymore. Julia gave an interview with a journalist, explaining how her father imposed every decision upon her life, how he played games to strip her of her freedom. When her story was published, it created a massive stir. The media competed to uncover every detail about Julia's family, and Julia found herself at the center of the unfolding events. Journalists, cameras, newspapers. Her name was everywhere. Many pointed out how wrong it was for such a powerful family to intervene so drastically in someone's freedom. But what was truly shocking was Julia's ability to turn this situation into an opportunity and stand tall. Nothing could be undone now. At first, Julia's father underestimated her escape, thinking he could brush it off easily. But when he saw the news spreading like wildfire and realized that with every passing hour, more people were talking about Julia's escape, he was shocked. His power, wealth, and thirst for control began to crumble before this small, determined woman. Julia's strength rapidly grew in her father's eyes, and with it, his anger and disappointment towards her intensified. But Julia had truly begun to fight against her father's power. She no longer just wanted her freedom. She wanted to build her own life, make her own choices. For years, she had obeyed every word her father said and learned what she should do in life. But now, Julia wanted to stand on her own, not just as the billionaire's daughter, but as her own person. And she had finally achieved it. The impact of Julia's media-driven resistance shocked not only her father but her entire family. Julia had found her voice and broken the chains of the life she needed to leave behind. She was no longer just a runaway girl. She was a strong woman who held her own fate in her hands. The identity her father had imposed on her was slowly fading as she ran away from it. Paul stood by her every step of the way. His support for Julia wasn't just about encouraging her, it was about showing her what it truly meant to have a family. The love and determination Paul showed Anna, he now showed Julia as well. Paul, who had sacrificed everything to give his daughter life, had now become a companion on Julia's journey too. They faced challenges and fears, overcoming every obstacle with trust in one another. With each passing day, Julia grew more courageous, drawing strength from Paul's loyal friendship and support. In that moment, she had made the hardest decision of her life. It was no longer about running, it was about staying, fighting, and ultimately winning. One evening, after their struggle for freedom, Julia and Paul decided to go to a quiet place just to rest. They sat by a small pond outside the town, watching the yellowed leaves reflect in the water. Both of their hearts were filled with a feeling that brought them closer with every passing day. Paul turned to Julia and smiled gently. Julia tried to hide the emotions in her eyes, but Paul knew her too well. In that moment, their freedom was the product of the trust between them and a bond that came straight from the heart. "Julia," Paul said, his voice deep and emotional, "meeting you was the best decision I've ever made. With everything so complicated, everything has become so much more meaningful with you. Being with you, I didn't just learn to be free, I learned what it really means to be together." Julia looked at Paul, taking a deep breath. There was a sparkle in her eyes. "Being with you was the best decision of my life. Because the more I got to know you, the more I realized that the life I was running from wasn't mine. Now, I'm ready to build a real life with you." Paul gently took Julia's hand. After a brief moment of silence, he said, "Sometimes, life brings us together in places we never expected. But here we are, and being here is more valuable than anything." Julia slightly lowered her head, locking eyes with Paul. As they moved closer to each other, feeling the trust in their hands, the distance between them disappeared. They closed the gap and kissed. In that moment, it was the right moment of their lives. Together, they had discovered not only the power of their freedom but also the strength of being by each other's side. They had broken free from the chains of the past and were stepping forward into the future, hand in hand, with hope. Julia was no longer just the billionaire's daughter. She was a woman building her own identity, her own life. And Paul had shown her what it truly meant to have a real family. And there, by the little pond, under the last light of autumn, their love came before everything else. Paul, finally gripping Julia's hand more tightly, looked into her eyes and said, "Julia, will you marry me?" In his eyes, the world was captured in a single sentence. "We can overcome everything together. We can build our future together. I want to do this with you." Julia felt her heart racing. Gratitude and love filled her eyes. She slowly nodded, a smile forming on her lips, signaling how right everything was in that moment. "Yes," she said, her heart fully in it, without hesitation. "Yes, I want to marry you." Paul couldn't hide his happiness. He immediately grasped Julia's hands tightly, and together they took the first step toward a new beginning. In that instant, the world around them seemed to vanish. All that remained was the love they shared. Their future would be built upon this very moment, where they held each other. They walked together by the pond, surrounded by the peace that freedom, love, and trust brought. They had turned a new page in their lives, a page that would only be written by the two of them. And in that moment, they had cast everything else aside and said yes to each other. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more content. Share your thoughts with us in the comments, we can't wait to hear from you. See you in the next story.